Hey folks, Jeff Salzman here, and welcome to the Daily Evolver. Thanks for tuning in. You can find all my stuff at dailyevolver.com. You can communicate with me using the Connect tab at the website, or just write me at jeff@dailyevolver.com. On to today's episode. Can developmental psychology help us respond more effectively to climate change? My guests, Terri OFallon and Gail Hochachka, both well known and respected in the integral world, say yes. In this episode, we discuss Gail's Ph.D. project at the University of Oslo, where she has utilized Terri's stages model to gain insight into how people at various developmental stages make meaning about climate change. Gail's findings were published in the prestigious peer-reviewed journal Global Environmental Change. I link to the article at the website. In this episode, we also hear from Terri about how climate change is viewed at the integral stages of teal and turquoise and above. I hope you will be inspired, as I was, to learn how these two pioneering women are creating a new basic science of understanding perspectives that will help humanity adapt and indeed transform in response to our climate challenge. Here's my conversation with Terri OFallon and Gail Hochachka, starting with Gail explaining the project.
So Terri and I got creative and came up with what I call the modified stages assessment to look at that data. And when we did it, I guess I wasn't, empirical studies, like actual real studies of developmental psychology in the area of climate change is rare to come by. And so I wasn't sure what we would see. And what we saw was really fascinating. So I ended up writing it up, and that ended up getting published, in quite, in my field of human geography, in quite a high level journal, which was very, in a way, ignorance is bliss. Rookies have it easy, right? People said, try for there. And it ended up getting through a peer review. And it was quite, a nice, rigorous peer review that approved it.
Oh, good.
Yeah. And then got us to the point where over the course of this, Terri started mentioning this idea of a specialty protocol where you actually do use the 36 sentence stem. And maybe we can describe more about that if you have any questions.
Okay. Let me just digest what you said.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
You are using Terri's stages model, STAGES, which is the name of her model of adult development, or actually human development.
Yes.
And we'll get to that, Terri. We have done a couple of shows with you on it. And so, I'll link to those as well. So you pour data that you have into this model, or look at data you have through this lens.
We synthesize. So what is Terri doing, or any of her scores using stages? What are they actually doing to assess written work?
Right. Okay.
Right. And so for this particular article, it came down to the objective awareness, the complexity of thought, and the scope of time. And that's what we use. Now, her model, when she assesses a 36 sentence stem, it's a bit more nuanced than that. But that's why I call this a modified one. This is one that you could use with those three. You could use that anywhere. If I'm going to make the claim that this should be brought into climate change work, we need to get really fluid with a very practical and kind of on the ground way to work with it.
Right. And
so using those three characteristics.
And again, those three characteristics are?
The objective awareness.
Okay, the objective awareness, the thing we're looking at, the thing we're describing.
Exactly. And so this is based on Terri's model as well. Gross objects, gross, which is concrete objects, like it's raining,
right?
Such as it's raining. Subtle objects, which is more abstract.
Okay, such as?
Increased precipitation. That's a more abstract way of understanding that phenomenon. And then something meta-aware. So meta awareness is awareness about awareness.
Right.
So it's the object is far more subtle, let's say.
Right.
And
right. So
Terri,
you can tell this through written language.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Great.
Yeah. I mean, just simply in the words that are used. And, in any case, any of us are attuning to how someone is construing reality. Like if you talk with my 7-year-old and, this morning, for example, I'm taking her to school and she goes, "What's your interview about?" And I said, "Well, it's about consciousness and climate change." And then I take a breath and I say, "When consciousness is," and then she goes, "Oh, look, Mom, what did she say? I can see my breath when I breathe," because it was cold out. And so that was just, it was over her head.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I had to, I mean, that was just literally, 20 minutes ago. So I had to kind of get back into her meaning making frame, which is more concrete than mine. Right.
Yes,
and so I let the conversation about consciousness go for a stretch. Right.
Oh.
So these are we may not be used to using those terms about it or tracking it, but we are usually attuned to how people are putting together meanings.
Yes.
So that's objective awareness.
Cool. So that's the first thing you're looking at. The second one is complexity of language, you said? Complexity
of thought.
Of thought.
So, and what I mean by that, and it relates a bit, of course, with objective awareness, but complexity of thought is thought put together in an atomistic way? Is it fragmented? So is it bits and pieces of data, or bits and pieces of understanding that there's no lines drawn between them? They're not taken as a whole or as a system, right? So that would be one level of thinking. One way to think of it is, linear. So cause and effect, X plus B equals C. And there starts to be sort of a mechanistic framing of how meaning is understood. So it's not just it's raining, but there's increased precipitation, and it is da 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 da, and it is da 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 da. And so it frames out a more sequential understanding of what is happening. Yeah. So the third one would be a later complexity of thought would be a more contextual way of thinking about something. So there's a more, one way to think of it, instead of A plus B equals C, the thinking would be it depends. It's increased precipitation, but it also depends on da da da. So it places the thinking in a context. So that's how I was working with it, just to give you an idea of what I meant by complexity of thought.
Yeah,
and
fantastic.
Then the third one, and these lead into each other, of course, but the third one was scope of time. And this one, Terri can explain more. This one usually is a bit like a product of the scoring that she does. It's not one of the things she tends to use, but it's actually quite relevant in climate change because, seeing the rain changing right now is different than ability to compare that with right now to the past, and which is again different than right now to the past to the future, which is again different than past, present, future generations, which again is different than that over evolutionary time, or even a sense of a perception of like timelessness. So that dimension is important, I believe, for consciousness in regards to how we make meaning about climate change.
Yeah. Wow.
So
or anything, really.
Or anything, really.
Yeah. And that's the beauty of these 3 points is that, they can be applied to anything.
Absolutely.
And to written language. That seems like a big deal, Terri.
Well, yes, this fits my 3 questions really, really well. All of them do. The concrete, subtle, and meta-aware objects is the first question. The complexity of thought really deals with 2 parts of the question. One is it complexity on an individual level, or is it complexity on a collective level? And the third is a complexity of thought, which also includes a time frame, because your thought becomes much more complex and much more nuanced when you can see far out in time. And we know that some stages see in the moment, some stages see about 5 years out, some see with 3 generations, some see with 5 or more, some see historically, some see with infinity and eternity. So those fit those 3 questions very, very well. And what I remember is that Gail sent me these photographs with the comments under them that people had written, and I scored them all because I can with those 3 questions, and I sent them back to Gail. And I think what Gail did that was so beautiful is that she put those 3 questions in terms that everybody can understand, and not as a scoring rule, which is what I think of, but as ways of looking at these processes that everybody can, in a kind of language that people can read about and understand better. So,
Yeah.
but they all come right out of the 3 questions very, very well, in
Wow.
my view. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I know you may have made some changes to some of the scoring that I did on those photos, Gail, but that's what I remember participating in first.
Yeah, I think I scored them actually first, and then you actually scored them again and adjusted a couple. It was really a great learning experience for me to see what you saw in how you were scoring. And it was only maybe 3 or 4 that you adjusted. But it was really helpful and very interesting.
Yeah. Well, so a very interesting and powerful, sounds like, a procedure here. Mm-hmm. So then what did you find, Gail?
Yeah. And maybe if I can just take one step back, and I will get to your answer, or to your question, but I just want to take one step back and just point out how enormous climate change is, and how naturally it's so almost ungraspable. Like, where do we find it? It's been referred to as a multiple object, a hyper object. Even some have said that we bring different meaning to bear on it, but some have said we can't ever really know it. So it's a particularly rich area to look at meaning making. In a way, I mean, this is similar to many things that we experience, but particular to climate change, people kind of grab what fragment they can and then build a whole meaning making about that. And then you try and go into an international meeting and have a conversation about collaboration, right? So it's complicated, right from the get-go. What we find in climate change research is and this is really exciting, there is a robust area more and more as many researchers, whether they're coming specifically from science or sustainability science, or from the more social science perspective, we're all realizing that this issue is bigger than we realized and is going to need a transformative change to really get at what it means. And so, there's more research into the social and the cultural dimensions and the psychological dimensions of it. What there isn't is much work with a developmental psychology perspective.
Yeah.
So that is, I believe, a bit of a missing knowledge set that is really exciting to think what it might share and what it might contribute to this emerging area of study.
Well, aren't there antibodies to the idea of the interiors of cultures and people developing? Isn't that a sort of a hard sell?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's true. That's what they say. And there's
Are people like receiving it and getting it? And
it's a bit divided. I definitely have people question me on it. We have to, as Ken Wilber says, we're always situated between the karma and the creativity of every moment. And so there is some karma that we need to kind of clean up here. And there has been, a lot of harm done with developmental thinking, that I believe has to be acknowledged well, skillfully, ethically, before we can really get to the creativity. So I'm very honest at that juncture here.
Oh, God bless you, Gail. I mean, I feel like I'm hearing evolution happen in real time as I listen to you.
Sweet. Oh, that's really sweet. I mean, so I'll just say, I mean, there is critical views that come up there, and in my sense, they should. Like we need them in the space. So I find that there's something compelling about these ideas that if they're held with that critical view, then we can really get somewhere here. So that the findings were really interesting. And this is just as I said, a pilot project. Like I'm hoping to do much more with this work. But just to give you a little sense of it, as I was saying, climate change being such a hyper object that
hyper object,
which
means
like massively distributed in space and time, so that in a way it verges on the unknowable. So,
wow,
or wicked problem. That's another way people say it. Wicked problem. they're getting to the same thing. Like the tools we have that we normally use as an adult are incommensurate with the complexity of the issue. And that's what I'm meaning. I'm kind of summing that all up with the word wicked problem or hyperobject, right? What we are seeing is that as we gain in the complexity of meaning making about this object of climate change, the slippery concept of climate change, we can essentially more fully know that complexity. And that kind of hinges on the subject's meaning making. So does that make sense? So the subject,
run that by me again.
Yeah. So as the subject's meaning making,
so as my meaning making,
right?
Okay.
As your meaning making, as my meaning making, as our meaning making gets increasingly more complex.
Yep.
Then more of the hyper object or the wicked problem, which is climate change, can be seen.
Absolutely. Yes.
And like that seems so straightforward, but it actually is. We skip over that all the time.
I know we do. I mean, it's crazy to me.
Yeah. I mean,
who can argue with let's bring in more perspectives, basically?
There's not much argument about it if it's recognized. But I think the problem, perhaps, is that, even if we're studying the psychology of climate change, we're still largely looking at what people believe about climate change, not looking as them to know how the meaning is being organized.
Hallelujah.
So looking as is a very different thing. And I'm not sure if you guys know this, but one of the really often, approaches to climate change is based on an information deficit model or a knowledge deficit model. And, well-meaning climate researchers or policymakers actually just believe people don't have the information.
Of course.
So they kind of they disseminate the information thinking it's going to be picked up and understood and all will be well. But it's not taking stock of how our people look as how your people are making meaning, and you come up with a very different range of how they can receive this information and understand it.
And if I may say, one of my critiques of the environmental movement is that the information is then delivered in a higher and higher decibel.
Right.
With a higher and higher fear factor, because you got to listen because I have this information. Well, good luck with that. There's more to the story here.
Yeah, exactly. And so with that recognition, then a lot of things become possible. And the ideas I presented in this paper, based on the findings, was that if you recognize, we could use these as worldviews, like traditional worldviews, modern worldviews, and postmodern worldviews. When we applied those questions of objective awareness, complexity of thought, and scope of time to this data, what we found were presence of these three worldviews in what could have assumed to be sort of a homogeneous community, but there was nevertheless this great range of meaning making about climate change. So what that presents when you can see the situation in that way is you can have greater possibility of alignment between climate change researchers or practitioners coming into a region, coming into a community, or working in a society. There can be better alignment. So it's, you're not just kind of, sending the same information with higher and higher decibels of volume and it not being picked up and you're frustrated why. The frustration of climate change being understood as weather change, that's going to persist for a long time. And best understand why that's the case than just lament what is the case, right?
Right. Yeah. If people who are thinking concretely and don't have a big dimension of time, the weather is the weather.
Yeah.
It's cold here in Boulder today. I could use a little global warming.
Totally. Yes. Yeah. And so how would you align, if you were a climate change practitioner, let's say, or a policymaker, how would you better align with that than just lament it and be frustrated by it and just try and put your climate science on that person? So alignment is one of them. And it's really on the practitioner's side, to grasp what's actually going on and align better. And then I building on the notion of translation. So what if someone were to translate their meaning making, whatever they make meaning of in terms of climate change, how would they build that out into sort of an adaptation strategy or a way to respond to climate change, but not from climate science, but from within their own meaning making. And I refer to that as not just translation, but sovereignty. What if you kept the sovereignty over your meaning making and built out solutions from that space? So those are some of the findings that kind of flowed out from that preliminary pilot project.
Wow. Terri, any comment at this point?
Well, I just admire so much what Gail has done with this, and it has helped open our own understanding of the developmental stages, and has given us the possibility of looking at where we can actually support really critical areas with our specialty protocols. Because this is
and let me stop you there, Terri. You've mentioned this a couple of times. Your specialty protocols.
We call them specialty protocols. We have a general protocol that we've worked with, and we've adapted it in the beginning so that there would be stems that would relate to the 4 quadrants so that people would give balanced responses. And so we took 9 stems out of the old general protocol that Lovinger and Suzanne used and changed it just enough so that there would be an average of about 8 stems in each, that would evoke responses from each quadrant. We did that with 350 protocols from the Stages model and a 900 from the earlier models. And the Crom box was beautiful. It was just the internal consistency between them was good. So once we did that, we realized, well, we can take 9 stems out of that protocol and put new ones in, and it's not that hard because the scoring system is identical regardless of what kind of a stem you put in there. And it also is we're able to score any kind of, we just use those same questions even on ordinary text, which is what I did when I rescored Gail's pictures in their comments. But I didn't realize at the time, we did one on leadership and it came out really well. We did one on love. It came out really well. We did a specialty protocol on education. It came out really well. But when I saw what Gail was doing on climate change, this is a very different kind of a topic because it is a global topic. It is something
happening over time. I mean,
yes,
it really does stretch the consciousness.
So I, Gail and I were thinking together about this and decided to do a specialty protocol on climate change, which would allow us to change 6 stems in the general protocol, but those 6 stems would relate specifically to climate change. And the good thing about this is because Gail is doing her dissertation, she has an IRB for it. And so we got enough people to take this specialty protocol so that we could get a Crom box alpha on it. And sure enough, it turned out internally consistent. And the other thing that happened with it is that even if we took the 6 climate change stems out themselves, they would still they still have good internal consistency. And those 6 stems can be used. If people don't want to take a 36-sentence inventory, they can just do 6 and we'll get tons of information about climate change just using those. And the good thing about having a sentence completion test is that people use their own words to describe this. And because they do, it's almost like an interview. So what we can do is look at how do we look at all of the completions that come up at let's say the traditional stage, and what kind of things do people say at that stage, so we can make categories about what are the ways that people look at climate change given these 6 stems. And then we can look at how they work at the modern stage. We look at what kind of categories come up at the postmodern stage, and even some of hers came up even in the meta-aware tier. So we can start seeing what is the trajectory of the ways that people see this. And there's a lot of research that we need to do on this yet, but that's one of the areas that we're kind of seeing as we look at these completions at these different developmental levels. And so of course there's 36 sentence stems, times 20 people, that's quite a few sentence stems, or even 6 times 20 is, over 100 responses that people have looked at. And that gets us started with some of the basic things that people think about climate change that is representative of their perspective. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to do more digging into the categories on how do people, what do they actually say about climate change?
Mm-hmm.
And then this is something that, I think, as Gail mentioned earlier, this is something that Gail can, and other people that go in to work with communities and the individuals about climate change can know what topics are salient at each developmental level and where they begin and where it kind of shuts off at. And also to recognize that there are perspectives that we probably haven't even seen yet, like in the meta-aware tier. And some perspectives came up there. And these are surprise perspectives and perspectives that,
Mm-hmm.
we haven't known about yet. So it's exciting
Wow.
to look at this.
Yeah, it really is. Well, Gail, fill us in. What do they say, and what have you learned?
Yeah, good question. For starters, I'll say that the actual analysis of the specialty protocol, I've not yet done. So you're going to have to wait for part 2 on that.
Okay.
I know it's exciting. We've all taken a look, and it's really exciting to see that the work in the pilot project, as I had said when I got up to pluralist in terms of meaning making. This one goes, as Terri was sort of hinting at, goes into the meta-aware tier. So it's going to be really interesting to look at that data. And I don't want to preempt those results before I have a chance to really analyze it well.
Oh, please.
Really?
I mean, what's your intuition? I mean, just blue sky it a little bit.
Well, blue sky, I can build. So put it this way: if what I said earlier holds,
Yes.
if what I said, which we would think it would, right? Mainly because my little pilot is represented, like it's reflects many of the findings of other work that Terri's done. But if we can take more perspectives, so our perspective taking increases, our objects of awareness become more and more subtle, and such that we're aware of our awareness. Suddenly and we can, our scope of time, we blast the walls off, and as well as the ceiling and the floor. We're in a very different space for making meaning about something as complex as climate change. And so I suspect a few things will happen. One big one is that you will look back on reality and realize, oh, we're all making meaning. We're all constructing meaning. And there'll be a greater recognition of the spectrum of meaning making that is happening. And so that alone can start to close this gap between my way is the right way and what is your way. Like, I don't get it. Right. So that gap is kind of, I hate to say it, coming from Canada, looking at you guys, politically, there's a problem right now. I mean, we have similar problems. We have similar problems. I'm not going to point fingers, but we need to close these gaps.
Yeah.
And we're not really going to do it until we can have some sort of way of seeing the constructed nature of meaning, not just bouncing off what someone said, but trying to kind of, rest with why they're putting meaning together that way.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a greater connection and a greater compassion that becomes available. So first of all, I think that is we're probably going to see that happen at these later stages. The other thing that we're going to be able to see is more of climate change itself. And so it is not going to just be more rain than usual for this time of year or something. We'll be able to see this sort of complex adaptive nature of these things set in their constructions, which includes how we have constructed this very problem. We've constructed this issue, both biophysically as well as how we're framing it in our meaning making. And that ushers in a whole different set of competencies and agency, really, to do something about it. So, I think it's exciting times. I've never, ever imagined that I would hear the calls for transformative change being as widespread as I am in what I call the progressive mainstream. And, in a way, we're all wanting, and when I say all, I mean researchers and practitioners and activists, we're all looking for what it means to meet that call for transformative change. If we can bring in developmental psychology as one of the knowledge sets in this endeavor, I think we're going to have some really exciting times ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, me too. How exciting.
Yeah.
So, Gail, how do the traditionalists make meaning about climate change?
Yeah, that's great. Well, I mean,
and modernists, and I know postmodernists, but
right.
I'd be still interested in hear your framing of it.
Sure. Well, starting with the traditionalists, what we find is that meaning is organized in bits and pieces in that atomistic way, and it's in the moment, and the complexity of thought is fairly fragmented. It's it really is weather change. And so, there's what I would say, this is now lifting off of my data as written and just talking to you about my impression, is there's sort of this honest, raw, genuine, like the well is dry, that's not right, or like we can't plant beans, just sort of the raw, genuine, authentic accounting in the moment. Now, whether that is put together in sort of a logical frame or a logical meaning making happens a little later. So in the modernist way of looking at it, what happens with this modern worldview is that suddenly they didn't just include, weather events or direct immediate impacts of those weather events. And instead it was looking at changes in practices culturally and economically that had cause and effect results of those actions to evoke a climate change. So pesticide use, or increased erosion, or, greater contamination of rivers that were feeding so suddenly there was an amalgam of cause and effect that was being seen within the context of climate change that was arising as climate change. And so at first the peer reviewers were like, why is there pesticide use being woven into their understanding of climate change? And I was like, this is what they're saying to me. Like, I'm not going to try and ignore that. This is the data. So what is the data seeing? And it actually is reflective of other research that has found at certain stages, climate change is understood by these proxies and linked to overall changes in a region, whether it's cultural, social, socioeconomic, even political. So suddenly the whole space is opened up. It's not just weather events and their impacts, but it's actually this series of interlocking changes that are, arising as climate change. So that's very, very interesting. So that's what we saw at Expert and leading into Achiever. And then Pluralist, you probably have some sense of that.
And this would be the postmodern Greens.
This is a postmodern Greens. Now, because, your area that you live is North America, Jeff, that's a different place than I was working. This was in El Salvador. So these people were developing pluralistic meaning making stages in that context, and how it was looking, which might be something that you will recognize from your North American community, but contextual understanding. So suddenly it was not just that climate change is weather, not just that this is an amalgam that has a cause and effect logical sequence, but now it was like a place-based understanding. What does this mean for us as a people? How, if we set this in a context historically and generationally, what does this mean? So the meanings were framed in that way. What is it? The fact that my grandparents passed by this region and perceived this nature, we won't have this if we continue on this trajectory. And it was a very different kind of, again, more expansive, right? It wasn't just, plant more seedlings. It was like, well, if I'm going to do that, what seedling should I plant in this ecosystem? What effect will it have contextually? Very different kind of meaning making about an issue that's this complex. So one aspect of that I wanted to get to that is exciting about it is that if we're getting out of a sample in, say, El Salvador, if it's, 1/3 traditional, 1/3 modern, and 1/3 postmodern, that is exciting. Like, that is exciting. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
So, that gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And, it feels to me as you describe this, and you too, Terri, that you're just in a way doing basic science. You're revealing this new strata of things and understanding that God knows where it's going to lead.
Well, that's what it seems like to me, because just the idea of having a verified inventory targeting a particular global issue like that I don't think it's been done that much, if at all. And, it isn't that difficult to do. And it is just basic perspectives. But if people understand that there are different perspectives on this, and the earlier levels are not going to care. Traditionalists
Yep.
are not going to care. But if there's empirical evidence, even the modernists really respect empirical evidence. So that should have some kind of an effect on them. And certainly the qualitative part will have a big effect on the pluralists. Then we go into the teal level, the strategist level, which is able to see development for the first time. And
this
I think,
is what we'll call the integral level.
yes,
or what I do anyway.
Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And once many of those folks are really turn into being quite good leaders, and so they will take that data and that understanding and use it in ways that can bring people together instead of separate them. So one of the big things about that level is that they believe in developmental rights. And that is a really important thing. And yet,
how would you describe that, Terri?
developmental Graves described it very, very well in his research. Everybody has the right to be the developmental level that they're at, and you can't punish them for being not being at a later level or an earlier level. They have that right, and that is developmental rights, and people can't see that until they get to be teal level. And of course that's a really important insight to see. As well, I think that as we see the developmental stages gradually grow up, we'll see that the people at the teal level are going to have a greater effect because of that understanding, because they will see that people that are traditional have a right to see what they see and say what they say, and not have this developmental opposition, because the earlier stages have that, because they can't tell that somebody is at a developmental level. And so that to me is what is going to start bringing this divide together a lot better, because there's always a way that you can help people get what they want without even having to know about the greater perspective. And people at the teal and later level can see that. And it doesn't necessarily mean you've got to get all those different levels in the same room together, because that's when the fights start. Sometimes it means you use other kinds of approaches to help people get what they want and what they need and what's important to them. And it takes the wisdom of teal and later to actually see that and see different kinds of collaborative efforts where you don't necessarily have to have people all in the same room at the same time, because then you find the differences start coming up instead of making sure that each group gets what they want and what they need.
Yep.
And usually that'll work.
And that they get to be where they are and who they are. I love that. Developmental rights. I hadn't heard that before, but I love that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that itself is such a huge developmental leap, it seems to me.
Yes, it
to
is.
Not describe people who are your political opponents, to not describe them as being stupid, co-opted, deluded, evil. I mean, this is what we just naturally do to the worldviews that we're not in.
That's
and
right.
At perspective or at integral, we get to breathe them all in a way.
That's right.
It's a whole new ball game. And that I don't know how that's going to affect the world, but we're seeing it. Yeah. And you guys, like I said, are doing some of the, it feels like the basic science of that. And I'm just so grateful.
Yeah, and I think this kind of basic science is not difficult for people to understand. It's it's unusual in that it uses a developmental frame, but people like statistical support, and statistics and empirical work helps us get at and sift out what isn't important and what is important. And then the qualitative research helps people feel what it is that is going on, and helps them relate to with their heart and their soul. And then when you put both of those together, which is what the teal does, then you get both. And so you can satisfy with that research, you can satisfy the uh, uh, the the longing that modernists have for making sure that there's statistically significant things, and the longing that pluralists have for feeling into something that is very real to them. And when you can do those two things together, you can usually satisfy the needs of the traditionalists, as long as you don't step on their traditional principles, which are basic principles that we all need to, for the most part, they're the traditions. We all need to, step into most of those kinds of ethics anyway. Thou shalt
Yes.
not kill, thou shalt not steal. That
Yeah,
is,
yeah.
yeah,
Dignity and honor and all of those things,
absolutely.
patriotism,
Yeah,
gratitude.
absolutely.
There's a lot that the traditionalist worldview has that the postmodern worldview has lost. And the integral worldview gets to bring them together
Yes.
in a way that is so exciting.
Well, one thing about the integral worldview and the 4.5 strategist teal level is that they both the traditionalists and the teal level develop principles. And we know what the principles are for the most part, that are more global and worldwide. There are individual groups that have different principles, but almost all of our traditional spiritual paths have very basic love your neighbor as yourself type of principles that fit us all and will
Yes.
always fit us all. But the thing that the principles that develop at the teal level are developmental principles. It's like this, one of those principles is everybody has a right to be at the developmental level that they're at. And every principle they have has a developmental twist to it so that it can work with every level. So it upgrades them into a much greater process that allows everybody to experience developmentally what these principles can actually help you experience.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, indeed. Gail,
Well,
how are people receiving this, and what's going on in terms of the just sort of immediate response here?
Well, one immediate response is that, getting back to what you said about science, doing basic science, there's one thing to create a theory, and there's quite another research process to test the theory and to develop the theory. And I feel like that requires that empirical of a theory, and like double fit it. Does it work? Why not? In which ways does it work? And can we develop that further? So I feel like I've been thinking about this over the past few days. That's really characterizes at least this part of my dissertation. I'm seeking to test and develop this theory in relation to climate change. In terms of where I think it's landing, well, it's a bit early to say in terms of my work. I'm hoping it'll land and actually invite this knowledge set into the research community. I'm looking at climate change adaptation. But I've also just wanted to say that, we're seeing movements and activism that is starting to take up this developmental understanding. And it's so back-ended, it's so backdropped that people aren't necessarily leading with it. But I recently found out that the Extinction Rebellion movement, which you probably are aware of, who the leader, the founder of that, Gail Broadbrook, I think her name's Broadbrook, she was describing the teal emergence, the teal worldview, and the leap to teal on an interview fairly recently. But yeah, she mentions spiral dynamics. She also apparently mentioned your podcast.
For heaven's sakes!
I know, and so these ideas are getting out there.
Yeah,
and it's not. This is no little drop in the bucket. I mean, these are widespread movements.
Yeah.
So we'll test the theories and we'll develop them, and we'll do some basic science and some qualitative research, and we'll get it out there
Yeah,
as we can, and it'll start to just go there anyway, right?
exactly. Well, if we're right about this, it's the next stage of human history, where we start bridging these divides. And
Yeah.
so cool. So anything else, Gail, that you'd like to put on the table before we close it out? I think this has been really fascinating.
Cool. I'm so glad to hear it. I really enjoyed talking to you both. The things I might want to mention is that, and it's a bit in regards to where this might, where this is going or how this is landing. And it's really just an invitation. I really want us to be able to see ourselves better. Those of us who are seeking to bring these ideas in to the area of climate change or any of the global issues that are sort of knocking on our door. So just really as an invitation to, be ideally this interview can kind of be a way that we can greater see each other and get together on that. I do sit on the board of a nonprofit organization called Integral Without Borders. And we, just to say that this will be in Spanish for those listeners who speak Spanish, but we're starting another round of a course with our Colombian and Argentinian partners. And it's called the Design of Integral Projects for Social Transformation. So it's very much in line with what we've been talking about. But then when you get out of science and into projects, like how do you design them for social transformation? In Spanish with Centro Integral Colombia, and also which is from Bogota, and also WETU, which is an Argentinian online education organization. So that's starting November 18th. And if anybody would be interested in that, then get in touch with Integral Without Borders.
Great. And I must say I'm a little bit stuck on your, I'm thinking maybe I'll make this the title of this episode, Adaptation into Transformation. Mm-hmm. And let me just have a little bit more on that.
Sure. Well, it's really interesting that adaptation is largely practiced and defined and practiced as a technical endeavor, what we call techno-managerial. It's like, let's put in new technologies and make people do things differently.
Right. This is basically the right-hand quadrants, the behavioral and the systems quadrants, the exteriors of reality.
Absolutely. So it's, that's what it is. And yet many people are saying, that's really insufficient. We can do that all we want, but if we're not going to get at these deeper, psychosocial issues, these are the real barriers to effective adaptation. And so what's happened since about 2014, the IPCC started using the term transformation alongside adaptation. Now, I can attest that people died getting those words in there. To get transformation in that document, I mean, that's a bit extreme, but that was how it was described to me. It was not easy, right? But it's in there. And so what we have now is these terms side by side, but they're very different concepts. So adaptation is, in a way, how do we adapt? How do we take climate change essentially as a given and adapt ourselves to it? And that largely is kind of understood as, technical. Transformation is wait a second, in order to adapt effectively, we need a transformative change in the structures and systems, in the practices, and in the meaning making that we run society, in how we participate in society. And so that is a very different agenda, if you will.
Yeah.
So it's fantastic we have these two, but in my estimation, they're still uncomfortably too distant.
Yeah.
Right? So we need to,
but at least they're there.
Absolutely.
At least they got them in the document.
Absolutely. It's a very exciting time in that sense.
Yeah.
And then since 2014, now we're 5 years later, more and more we're hearing that call for transformative change. And it's not just out of IPCC, it's also out of IPBES, so the Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So that's the biodiversity loss component, intergovernmental panel.
Right on.
They're saying it equally as clearly that we need this. So it's, in a way that's really exciting. If we were to, so I noticed that people, when they start with transformation, it's almost too overwhelming. What are we talking about? It's everything all at once. It's like a polycentric, dynamic systems change agenda. And whoa, what is that? And it can easily become metaphor. It can easily become, philosophical calls for something that isn't grounded in a practice, right?
Yep.
So my thought was, this is another piece, a contextual piece of my dissertation is, if we were to start with adaptation and actually just fill out the quadrants at least. So instead of just it being the right-hand quadrants, but also the left, and we have research into these psychosocial adaptive capacities. They're actually called subjective adaptive capacities or intersubjective adaptive capacity. What if we all got those on the same page? The theory, the integral theory, suggests that as you do that, it generates transformation.
Right. Exactly.
So like, I don't know if that would be the case or not, but yeah. So I don't know if like, without getting into those claims, let's just stay with doing that and see what would happen.
Yeah, fantastic. No, absolutely. You do that and I'll make the claims in the meantime. So Terri, what do you see as you look at the higher stages, particularly as it relates to climate change?
So what we know in our research that people at the transpersonal stage can do is that they can look at systems, and they can look at global systems, very large global systems, and they can see one part of the global system that isn't working, and then they can look around the world and say, oh, here's another piece. Let's just take that piece out that doesn't work, and let's stick this piece in. Oh, well, now I see what happens. The whole system reconfigures when I put that part of the system is. And now I've got another part of the system that doesn't work so well. Let me take that part out, and I look around the world and I find another one. Oh, well, look at if I put this in here. So they see how individually they can imagine in their own minds reconstructing a global system that might be healthy and ethical for everyone in the world. And they may want to have more freedom to do that, which they won't have if they are only allowed to deal with the social construction of reality that we have right now at 4.0 and 4.5.
Which is postmodern green.
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Right.
So I mean, my thought is that it's possible that they will want to shift the structural aspects of governing that we have, that 4.0 and 4.5, the teal and pluralist level have, shift the level of governing to give them some more individual freedom to actually dream up in their mind, construct in their mind whole systems that they can see evolving through time, with evolution being a part of the actual process of the systems that they have, automatic evolution. I mean, all of that can come into being, and they can do it at an individual level. And some of the geniuses we have are already imagining these things, but they're held back in some ways by the systems that are so, by the very nature of our world the way it is today. It's really difficult to deconstruct them, like our money system and our, all of these sorts of things.
Well, welcome to human history.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
But imagining it is significant. Yes. Imagination is a real thing. Yes. And it clears away the field so that we can actually think in new ways.
In new creative ways, and allows you to have a space to actually implement something like that. So that would be the next step. And then when we get to 6.0 and 6.5, we have the new MetaWare Collective, which is really everything. And it also deals with more of a timeless, boundless setting. The states and stages start coming together quite a bit at those two levels. So one can only massage their own imagination to see what we would have if that kind of thing would come into being. But that's a little bit of what I'm seeing, and I don't know whether it will happen or not, but I'm just looking at the repeating patterns. That's all.
It's important to think about it. It's, it's part of bringing it into being. Mm-hmm. Right on.
I'm just filled with gratitude for this conversation, Jeff. You are a wonderful moderator. You dig things out of us we didn't know we had, and I love that.
True. It's very true.
Well, thank you so much. And it's my privilege to do this. And I leave this conversation far more encouraged that things actually are a little further along than I thought.
I think
so. I think my listeners will have that same experience. Yeah. And so we're all grateful to you and your work. Terri OFallon and Gail Hochachka, Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you, Terri.
Bye-bye.